Imagine being born into a palace, surrounded by gold, velvet, and servants. Yet from your very first breath, your life is already considered a disappointment. That was the fate of Elizabeth Tudor. She would one day become Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Her reign transformed England into a rising world power, encouraged literature and exploration, and defeated one of the strongest military empires on earth. But none of that seemed possible on the day she was born. In fact, many people believed she was nothing more than a royal mistake. This is the incredible story of the girl who was expected to disappear into history, but instead changed it forever. England, September 7, 1533. The royal palace of Greenwich was filled with excitement. King Henry VIII waited anxiously outside the Queen's chamber. For years, England had been holding its breath. The king desperately wanted a son. Not simply because he wanted a child, but because he believed only a boy could safely inherit the throne. Without a male heir, England could fall into civil war once again. Everything depended on this birth. Servants rushed through the corridors. Church bells stood ready to celebrate. Royal officials prepared documents announcing the arrival of England's future prince. Then, the doors opened. The baby had arrived. But instead of hearing cheers, the palace became strangely quiet. It was a girl. Her name was Elizabeth. For most families, the birth of a healthy daughter would have been a joyful occasion. For King Henry VIII, it felt like another heartbreaking failure. His disappointment spread quickly throughout the court. The celebrations that had been planned for a prince suddenly became much smaller. The lavish tournament prepared in honor of a future king was quietly cancelled. England had not received the heir everyone expected. Instead, they had another princess. Few people realized that this tiny baby girl would one day become far greater than any son Henry could ever have imagined. To understand why Elizabeth's birth caused such disappointment, we need to understand her father. King Henry VIII was one of the most famous and feared rulers in English history. He was intelligent, charming, athletic, and incredibly ambitious. But he was also stubborn, impatient, and willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. More than anything else, Henry wanted a son. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given birth to only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. Henry feared that placing a woman on England's throne would lead to political instability. Believing that his marriage had failed to produce the male heir he desperately wanted, he sought to end it. When the Pope refused to grant an annulment, Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England, making himself its supreme head. This dramatic decision transformed not only his family but the religious future of the entire kingdom. At the center of this revolution stood a young woman named Anne Boleyn. She was intelligent, confident, and unlike any woman Henry had ever known. Henry became completely captivated by her. He believed and would give him the son destiny had promised. After years of political conflict and religious upheaval, Henry finally married Anne. Soon afterward, she became pregnant. The entire kingdom waited for the arrival of England's future prince. Instead, Elizabeth was born. Although Henry was disappointed and believed there would be more children, she was certain she could still produce the son the king desired. But fate had other plans. Over the next few years, Anne suffered devastating miscarriages. Each loss increased Henry's frustration. The king who had once written passionate love letters to Anne now began looking elsewhere. Rumors spread through the royal court. Powerful nobles whispered against the queen. Her enemies sensed an opportunity, Then, in 1536, everything changed. Anne Boleyn was arrested. She was accused of adultery, treason, and even plotting against the king. Most modern historians believe these accusations were either exaggerated or entirely fabricated, driven by political motives rather than evidence. Whether guilty or innocent, Anne had become an obstacle to Henry's desire for another marriage and, he hoped, a male heir. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Only days later, she was sentenced to death. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne walked calmly toward the scaffold inside the tower. She prayed quietly. She forgave the king. Then, with a single stroke of a French swordsman's blade, her life ended. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. She would never remember her mother's face. The consequences for little Elizabeth were immediate and devastating. Within hours of Anne's execution, Parliament declared Henry's marriage to Anne invalid. If the marriage had never legally existed, then Elizabeth was no longer considered a legitimate princess. She was officially labeled illegitimate. In other words, according to the law, she had lost her rightful claim to the throne. Her royal household was dissolved. Many servants left. Her status at court collapsed almost overnight. The magnificent future once imagined for her simply vanished. People who had once bowed before the little princess now treated her as though she barely mattered. In the ruthless world of Tudor politics, a child without political value could quickly become invisible. Many assumed Elizabeth's story was already over. Some believed she would spend the rest of her life forgotten in the countryside. Others thought she might eventually be married off to a foreign noble for political convenience. Almost no one imagined she would ever rule England. She was no longer seen as the future of the kingdom. She was simply the unwanted daughter of an executed queen. But history has a remarkable habit of surprising those who think they know the future. The little girl everyone dismissed as nobody was quietly developing qualities no one could yet see, an extraordinary intelligence, a sharp memory, and a determination that would one day reshape a nation. And while England had already written her off, Elizabeth Tudor was only beginning her story. After losing her mother, Elizabeth lost much more than a parent. She lost her place in the royal family. Yet while others overlooked her, she devoted herself to learning. Elizabeth received one of the finest educations in Europe. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, while also studying history, philosophy, mathematics, and theology. Her intelligence impressed everyone who taught her, and these years of study prepared her for challenges no one could yet imagine. Meanwhile, King Henry VIII continued searching for the son he desperately wanted. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave birth to Prince Edward in 1537 but died soon after childbirth. Henry later married 3 more times before his own death in 1547. 9-year-old Edward became king, while Elizabeth lived quietly away from court. But even there, danger followed her. After Henry's death, Elizabeth lived in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour, behaved inappropriately toward the teenage princess. When Seymour was later accused of plotting against the government, Elizabeth was questioned but wisely kept herself out of the scandal. She had learned an important lesson. At the Tudor court, silence could save your life. England was also becoming deeply divided over religion. Under Edward VI, Protestant reforms expanded, creating tensions that would soon shape Elizabeth's future. Then, in 1553, Edward died at just 15 years old. His half-sister Mary became queen. Mary was a devoted Catholic. Elizabeth was a Protestant. And as the next heir to the throne, she suddenly became one of the most dangerous people in England, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Soon, that danger would become terrifyingly real. When Mary became queen, she restored Catholicism across England. Many Protestants opposed her rule. In 1554, a rebellion broke out against the Queen. Although there was no proof that Elizabeth had taken part, many believed the rebels supported her claim to the throne. Mary could not ignore the threat. Elizabeth was arrested. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same prison where her mother had spent her final days before execution. For weeks, she was questioned about the rebellion. Did she know the rebels? Had she planned to overthrow the Queen? Elizabeth denied every accusation. No evidence could prove her guilty. Instead of execution, she was placed under house arrest at Woodstock Palace for nearly a year. Those months taught Elizabeth the value of patience. She realized that surviving often required silence, self-control, and careful judgment. Meanwhile, Mary faced growing problems. Her unpopular marriage to Philip of Spain and the execution of hundreds of Protestants damaged her reputation, earning her the nickname Bloody Mary. Then, in 1558, Mary died without children. At 25 years old, Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England. The prisoner had become the Queen. Elizabeth was crowned on January 15, 1559. Many doubted that a young woman could rule successfully. She proved them wrong. One of her first priorities was ending years of religious conflict. Through the Elizabethan religious settlement, she restored the Church of England while bringing much-needed stability to the kingdom. Parliament constantly urged Elizabeth to marry and produce an heir. She refused. Believing no husband should control her crown, she devoted herself entirely to her country and became known as the Virgin Queen. Under Elizabeth's leadership, England entered a remarkable period of prosperity. Trade expanded. Exploration flourished. Writers like William Shakespeare transformed English literature, while explorers such as Sir Francis Drake carried England's influence across the seas. This period became known as the Elizabethan Golden Age. But Elizabeth's greatest challenge was still ahead. Across the English Channel, King Philip II of Spain was preparing the most powerful fleet Europe had ever seen. The Spanish Armada was on its way. In the summer of 1588, England held its breath. Far across the English Channel, the Spanish Armada was sailing toward the English coast. It was the largest fleet Europe had ever seen. More than 130 ships, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors, had one mission: to invade England, remove Elizabeth from the throne, and restore Catholic rule. Many believed the outcome was already decided. Spain was richer. Its army was stronger. Its empire stretched across the world. England seemed hopelessly outmatched. But Elizabeth refused to show fear. As enemy ships approached, the Queen rode to Tilbury, where English troops waited for battle. Dressed in a white gown with a breastplate over it, she addressed her soldiers with words that would become some of the most famous in British history. She declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Her speech inspired the army. It reminded her people that courage is not measured by strength alone, but by determination. When the fighting began, England used speed and strategy instead of brute force. Its smaller, faster ships repeatedly attacked the Spanish fleet from a distance. Then, one night, the English sent burning fireships drifting toward the anchored armada. The Spanish captains panicked, cut their anchor cables, and scattered into the darkness. The English navy seized the opportunity. At the Battle of Gravelines, they inflicted serious damage on the Spanish fleet. Unable to safely invade England, the Armada was forced to retreat. As the surviving ships sailed north around Scotland and Ireland, violent storms struck. Many vessels crashed against rocky coastlines. Others sank into the sea. Only about half of the original fleet returned to Spain. The failed invasion became one of the greatest turning points in English history. Elizabeth's leadership had helped save her kingdom. The victory transformed England's reputation. People no longer saw it as a small island vulnerable to powerful enemies. Instead, England emerged as a confident and growing naval power. Elizabeth became a national hero. For the rest of her reign, her popularity remained remarkably strong. Although challenges continued, the kingdom enjoyed greater stability than it had known for generations. Elizabeth never married. She never had children. Because of this, the Tudor dynasty ended with her. In her later years, many of the trusted advisors and friends who had served her for decades passed away. Their deaths deeply affected her. The energetic young queen gradually became quieter and more reflective. Still, she continued to govern with the same dedication that had defined her entire life. On March 24, 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died at the age of 69 after ruling England for 44 years. The crown passed peacefully to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland under one monarch. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey, where visitors can still pay their respects today.